The record reflects we are back in session. Parties and counsel are present. All members of our jury and alternates are present, and you may resume your examination.
Thank you. Mr. Shogren, before the break, I was asking you about whether or not you had prepared a chart, basically a date chart pertaining to the ledgers that would, on any given day, show the balance between Joseph and Chase. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And is that, and I showed you a copy of that, was that, that was Exhibit 1124. Is that accurate as to the chart that you prepared?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to show you, I'm going to have to put it on the overhead, and hopefully we can get a better view. Gosh. Maybe not, but we'll do the best we can. If you can just, and I'm starting here at page 1, and it looks like the date is November 7th, 2008, and if you could just kind of point out what we're looking at here, and we'll see if the monitors may give a better view, but actually let's try and zoom in. It's a little better.
So the first line of this is, as you said, 11/7/2008. A payment made to Western Union in the amount of $869.94, and that's charged to Chase Merritt as an amount paid to him. So it was obviously not paid to him, but it was paid on his behalf. And then in this column, we have underpaid, overpaid, and underpaid. So if it's overpaid, it has brackets around it.
So if we go down that list until January 5th of 2009, if we go down that list, what are we looking at all the way to January 5th of 2009? Oops. I did something. Ma'am? There we go. Can you see January 5th on the left side?
So January 5th here, and Will triple.
Sorry. Trying to fit it. Okay.
Will Triple Blue is the first job that we have a payment coming in for.
So as before January 5th, it looks like there's an amount of $20,990, and it's in brackets. What does that mean? And then what does the $8,534 adjustment mean?
So this is the accumulated value of all of these payments made from here to the top. And we started at 0. The first one added $869.94, and all of these total $20,990. And that would be an overpaid amount. It's amounts that are being paid out for Chase with no income coming in. This is the first job that would come in that would offset those.
Okay.
And at that point, then the amount overpaid is reduced by that $8,534.
So if we keep going down to the end of this exhibit, we have more payments coming in, and then at the bottom of this page anyway, it shows an amount of $973. And if you could explain that.
So we have more expenses being paid, and then these are offset. So we get back to a total of $20,733, and then these offset that nearly in the entirety, so that at this point, which is the 10th of January, the out of balance, if you will, number is only $973.55 overpaid.
Okay. And as payments come and go, and payments are made to Chase, those amounts, that amount, whether it's overpaid to Chase or underpaid to Chase, changes. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So let's go to the next page. If we're going to the top here, and let's say, let's go to January 12th. At the end of the day on January 12th, if we were to kind of do an arbitrary cutoff on that date, where would Chase and Joseph stand?
So these are amounts that are owed but not yet paid, and they accumulate now totally from the beginning of this chart to 16,315 that's underpaid at that point in time.
And then on January 12th, there's actually another payment made, correct, to Chase?
There's a check
Okay.
made on his behalf or to him, one or the other, and for $1,500, and that brings this down. So you can see the interaction between this ongoing balance for each of these transactions. So anytime we have a period of time where there are a number of jobs that are that payment is received for and the money has come in, that causes that underpaid amount to go up and offsets any overpaid up to that point.
So at the end of the day on January 12th, 2009, if let's say Joseph were to send an email as to the status of their account, he would, the email, at least according to your calculations, would show that Joseph would have owed Chase $14,815.45.
On that day, that's correct.
Okay. And again, that on January 15th, the amount escalates that Joseph owes Chase to $23,251. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that's reflected
Right.
on,
Right here.
okay. And then more payments are made, and at least whoever the checks are made out to, they're charged to Chase, correct?
That's correct.
And so all these payments that are made down the line, then we get into another point, let's say February 4th, 2009, what happens to the account between Chase and Joseph at that time, on February 4th?
So you're referring to this line
Yes.
where, and that's at a point where, because of this $4,000 payment to Chase, we've now gone into an overpaid situation of $16,22.24.
Okay. So is that illustrating the way this running ledger was working between Chase and Joseph?
At any given point in time, that number is going to change depending on what the most recent payment received or payment owed would be.
Okay. Now, you mentioned something, the checks that were issued to Chase or on Chase's behalf are not always issued to Charles Merritt. They're issued maybe to third parties. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So if Chase wanted a payment sent, let's say, to Catherine Jarvis for some emergency, for example, would that be reflected in Joseph's ledger?
Objection, speculation.
And hearsay.
Well, we will look at the minutes if he has anything.
Yes, if he's making payments on Chase's behalf to a third party, it's going to reflect as amount paid to Merritt on this.
And did you see such checks where payments were made to third parties and yet they were charged to Chase?
Yes.
Okay. Now, given the time frame of November 7th, 2008 to January 28th, 2010, did you have, were you able to calculate the highest amount that was overpaid at any given time to Chase? Meaning, at any given time, what was the largest amount Chase owed to Joseph? I'm going to go to page 5.
I'm sorry, the amount overpaid, I was not sure.
Yes, the highest amount overpaid in an overpayment status, meaning the amount, the highest amount that Chase owed Joseph at any given time along that time frame.
Correct, that's this number, $20,990.19.
Okay, and that was on what date?
12/31/2008.
And what was the highest amount that Joseph owed Chase at any given time on that spectrum?
Was $23,251 at 1/15/09.
I want to talk about two jobs that you referenced earlier that were also referenced on the memo, the Saudi Arabia and Paul Mitchell jobs. And you recall that, correct?
Yes,
Now, did you do a worksheet regarding Saudi Arabia and the money flow on the Saudi Arabia job?
yes.
Okay, and I'm going to refer to Exhibit 1115. Do you have that?
I don't have an exhibit number marked on it.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
You see that?
Yes.
Okay. Again, I have to put it up on the overhead. And when it's up, when I put it up here, if you can just kind of, if you could for the jury, explain what we're looking at here, provided they could see it.
So this first is when the project appears in QuickBooks, and it appears in a list of invoices. The invoice is this, what, difficult to read, $30,771.25 is a 50% deposit against the sales price of $61,542.
And that's the 50% down that was, that you referred to earlier, correct?
That's correct.
So we should see at some point a $50,000 payment from Saudi Arabia to Joseph, correct?
That's correct.
And did we see that?
We did.
And where's that?
So on the 22nd of January, $30,733.25 came in by wire.
Okay. And is that underneath it says this information was obtained from the bank account, EIP bank account, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then January 22nd, there's another transaction, is that correct?
That's correct. So you'll notice that the timing is the same on those 122.10. When the payment is received, the deposit is received, that's when the payments begin to flow to materials or suppliers, and this one went to Metro Sheet Metal for $92.50.
Okay. And that is reflected through a check, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and that's also drawn on the EIP bank account, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, it looks like that's a payment for 50% also to Metro Sheet Metal, is that correct?
Correct.
So that would be 50% of what Joseph is going to owe Metro Sheet Metal.
That's correct.
So there's still more money to pay to Metro Sheet Metal for the Saudi Arabia job, is that how you read that?
Leading speculation.
Overruled the answer.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And then, box number 4. What are we looking at in box number 4?
So, in box number 4, there's this reference to the email is the email that we've discussed previously from 2/1/10.
Okay.
And in that is a reference to the Saudi Arabia 15% 7725. That's actually only 13% of the total invoice, but it's referenced there. There's a savings of $6,500 referenced and an install price of $4,000 with a total for this job owed to Chase of $18,225.
Okay, so let me just put that exhibit 419. And this is the email, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And if you could just show the jury what you're referring to.
So I was referring to this line here, and that's the line that's at box 4, if you will, on the previous slide.
So since that 50% deposit was received on January 22nd from Saudi Arabia, is that when the liability to Chase starts to accrue?
Objection, speculation.
Overruled the answer.
Payments begin when the deposit is received from the customer.
And is that why we don't see it on the 2009 ledger?
That's
Objection
correct.
calls for speculation, lacks foundation.
Sustained.
Move to strike any answer.
If there was an answer to the last question, the answer is strictly in jury's instructed.
Well, the payment was received on January 22nd, 2010, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And, all right, so let's go to box number 5. Let's see if we can you see box 5, or should I?
Yeah, I can see it. I'd rather see it smaller if I could, just so I
Sure.
can reference to the side.
I'll go smaller if you just, what is box 5?
This is box 5, and we're referencing 3 checks written to Charles Merritt from EIP,
Okay,
and those checks are here.
okay. Are they dated, are they,
So they're dated 2/2/10, 2/4/10, and 2/4/10 in these amounts. With respective check numbers. And the amounts $24.95, $6,500, and $23.50.
is that $6,500 check dated 2/4, is that referenced anywhere in the email from Joseph?
It matches the savings number in the email at savings of $6,500 for the Saudi Arabia job.
Okay, and I have it up there, I just briefly put that line up there blown up. So,
It's that savings $6,500.
okay. Then if you go to box 6.
So box 6 references a wire that came in that Dan Kavanaugh received from Kokache.
And what date is that?
That's 3/5. It'd be over to the right of this.
Okay, now, all right, so I'm gonna scoot over to the right here.
So this is a description off of a bank statement that references the amount wired, the wire and all of its metadata, and the 16,839.25 amount on 3/5.
And how do you know it went to Dan Kavanaugh?
Because it was found in his Bank of America account.
Is that where it's noted below the
That's
box
correct.
here?
That's correct.
So that was the Bank of America account ending 8279,
That's correct.
which belonged to Dan Kavanaugh, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and there was a $13,000 wire as well?
Yes, that was a wire that Chase received on the same day from the same folks.
Kokache?
From Kokache, 13,862, and again it was on 3/5 and the wire transfer, and it went into Chase's Bank of America account.
Okay, and what was the total amount that was paid by Kokache or Saudi Arabia on this job? Is that reflected in the box at the bottom?
Yeah, so the total received was 61,434, and the original amount was 61,542. So it was within a few dollars of that original sales amount.
Okay. I want to talk to you about the Paul Mitchell job. On the Saudi Arabia job, are you aware of any claims, in review of the record, any claim or chargeback on the Saudi Arabia job that it didn't get complete, or the Saudi Arabians reversed the charge, or anything of that nature?
We did not find anything that indicated that.
Okay. Okay, so on the Paul Mitchell job, that's exhibit 1133, and you did a worksheet on that as well, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I'll show you what's been marked as 1133. Okay, we'll go to box, what are we looking at here?
I'm sorry, I'm just behind
Sure.
catching up here.
Now,
So-
okay, before you do that, you were granted a access to QuickBooks accounts for Joseph and EIP, is that correct?
We were,
Through the use of a clone.
that's right, we received about 2 weeks ago access to 3 clone accounts.
So can you explain to the jury what that meant for you in terms of accessing records?
We were able then to see some records we hadn't been able to see before. One of the principal ones was our ability to look at invoices.
Okay. And did you find an invoice for the Paul Mitchell job through the use of the clone?
Yes, we did.
And what was the job total for Paul Mitchell?
The job total was $31,500.
Okay. And was there a 50% deposit made?
There was, this is reflected in QuickBooks as well,
And that's in box 2?
and it's in box 2.
Okay. And that payment was made on what date?
January 25, 2010.
Now, January 25, 2010, so in 2009, is it correct that we did not see it on the ledger on the 2009 ledger?
That's correct.
Okay. But once that payment was received on January 25th, in your opinion, the obligation or the liability to Chase then begins, is that correct?
Objection again calls for speculation.
Overruled.
That's correct.
Okay. So if we look at box 4, what are we looking at in box 4?
This is a record of a check that was written to Metro Sheet Metal for $6,350.
Okay. And that was found in Joseph's EIP bank account ending 3626?
That's correct.
Okay. And then box 5?
So box 5 takes us back to the email dated February 1, 2010, where we see the...
I'll put the email up. So we see at the top there, Paul Mitchell, correct?
Correct.
PM.
So this is the 15%, 4725, with savings of 3050, with a total due to Chase of 7775.
Okay. So on box 6, what are we looking at?
Box 6, we reference a check that was written to written to Charles Merritt from EIP for $4,500. And we'll see that that came out of EIP account in ending in 3626.
Okay. Now let me ask you just, and we'll get right back to this. Did you find in looking at all the checks that were issued that many checks were either issued to Chase Merritt for these projects? For Charles Merritt to then go and spend on whatever to complete the project?
Objection leading lacks foundation calls for speculation.
Sustained is calling for speculation and conclusion.
Remember on the ledger we had all those check amounts at the bottom of the ledger portion?
Yes.
Could you explain how that fits into the ledger and the amounts that were that we saw below the ledger portion of the exhibits?
So on the ledger, there's the top part where we show the revenue and how it's going to be shared between Joseph and Chase. The bottom half of that, although it tends to be more than half in 2009, is a list of all of the checks that then are written that would be attributable to either Joseph's obligation to pay or to Chase's obligation to pay. And those checks are then what reconciles that ledger over time.
Based on your review of the ledgers and the actual checks themselves, did you see that majority of the checks are issued to Charles Merritt directly?
Objection assumes facts, not evidence.
Overruled, he can answer if he has an opinion.
I'm not sure that the majority of them were, a large number of them were written to Chase, but I'm not sure, I've not done a count. to
Objection, lacks
tell you.
foundation, non-responsive, move to strike.
Overruled, he answer remains.
Let's go back to our box, I think we're on box 6. You may have already talked about box 6.
I think we just did. box
Okay,
six.
box 7.
So box 7 is the, when we, over to the right, we'll see that there was a wire transfer from Mitchell. And so we've got the information on the wire transfer and the amount of $5,000. And that occurred on February 22nd.
Okay. Now, are you aware of any claim that was made on the Paul Mitchell job to show that it either didn't get complete or there was a chargeback of any kind? Was there anything like that you were able to review?
We found no records of any claim.
Okay. Now, you mentioned this 65% way of doing business, and then it switched over in October of '09 to this 15% model.
Objection,
Af-
misstates the evidence.
Overruled.
After Joseph disappeared, and so let's say in mid-February of 2010, did that model change yet again based on your review of the records?
It did.
Can you explain?
Yes, what we found is that under the 15% model, Chase was now making payments he would not have made under that model. They were reverted essentially to payments he would have made under the 65% model.
Was that due to the emergency nature of what they were facing at the
Objection
time?
calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Did you know that there was a rush or a rush to get the Saudi Arabia job done?
Objection, lacks foundation, calls for hearsay.
Sustained.
So you said that the model changed at that point, correct? Did that also change for Saudi Arabia and for Paul Mitchell?
It did.
Okay. Do you have an opinion as to why that changed? Was there anything in the records from an accounting point of view as to why that changed?
An object calls for speculation.
Sustained.
I want to talk about checks that were issued. You reviewed a number of checks, is that correct, that were issued by Joseph and through his Union Bank account, is that correct?
That's correct.
Did you see in his account history that at times there would be gaps in check sequence numbers?
We did.
Is that something that's common in with construction companies?
I have seen that often because there would be checks that would stay in an office or a home office and checks being taken in a truck so that they could be paid on the spot. So you'd have kind of two sets of checks, if you will.
Okay. And you have a particular, I wouldn't say expertise, but you have a particular knowledge and particular training when it comes to construction companies, is that correct?
That's correct.
And how so?
Well, in addition to having been a Class B general contractor at one point, I also ran a modular construction company for 6 years. So.
Okay. Now, even though EIP wasn't a traditional construction company, did it operate along the same lines as far as you could review?
Objection, speculation, lacks foundation.
Overruled, he can answer.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes. Did you notice that EIP operated in some fashion when it came to payments as a construction company would operate.
Objection relevance.
Sustained.
Did, well, you said that there was gaps and you noticed gaps in the checks,
Yes,
Joseph's checks.
yes.
Did you notice, well, with your experience in construction companies, do construction companies give blocks of checks to their subcontractors or to their workers to go out and buy materials? Is that a common occurrence?
I've seen,
Objection, speculation, relevance, lacks foundation.
Sustained on relevance as to what other construction companies may do.
Would the fact that there's gaps in Joseph's checks over the history be consistent with Joseph giving blocks of checks to individual or individuals to issue checks to for materials and so forth?
It would be
Objection calls for
consistent.
speculation.
Objection sustained. If there was an answer to the last question, it's stricken. The jury is instructed to disregard it.
You saw gaps in the check sequence numbers in 2009, is that correct?
yes, I believe it was in 2010.
Okay. And in 2010 as well, correct?
That's correct.
All right. Now, did you get a sense by reviewing Joseph's account that he would allow Mr. Merritt to write checks on his account?
Objection, improper opinion.
The objection sustained is calls for speculation and confusion.
Did you notice well, did you also get to review Mr. Merritt's account, bank
Yes,
account? And did you become familiar with the way Joseph would issue his checks, his handwritten checks?
yes,
And did you become familiar with the way Charles Merritt issued his checks?
yes,
Would it be fair to say that there was instances where Chase would write out checks on Earth-inspired products, checks?
It appears so.
Objection, and that
Objection.
calls for speculation, lacks any foundation.
Sustained.
You
We're
heard,
gonna strike any
Again,
answer.
if there was an answer, it's stricken. The jury is instructed to disregard it.
you heard the testimony of Sergeant Smith here where he described how Joseph would issue checks, capital C, capital M, and he would write it out. And then when he wrote out the amount, it would all be lowercase. Do you recall that?
Yes,
And did you see that when you looked at that yourself? Did you see that Sergeant Smith was right, that that's the way Joseph issued his checks?
So I'm
Objection,
gonna-
improper, Your Honor.
Overruled an answer.
I need to back up because I think I misunderstood the previous question that you asked about Sergeant Smith, is that correct?
Yes.
I don't-
Sergeant, did you hear Sergeant Smith's testimony when he testified how Joseph wrote out his checks?
I did not.
Oh, okay. Did you notice that Joseph wrote out checks that with the capital C when he was handwritten, and then he would capital the C, capital the M,
Yes, I have seen that.
and then when he write out the amount, it would be all lowercase?
Yes,
Okay. And that seemed to be consistent with Joseph writing out checks, correct?
yes.
And did you see checks in that account that were not like that?
There were handwritten checks.
Correct.
Yes, there were handwritten checks that were not like that.
Okay. Now, when you looked at the ones that were handwritten that were not like that, did that handwriting appear to be Chase's handwriting?
Objection calls for
Objection.
speculation, lacks foundation.
Did you notice that Joseph would make deposits into Chase's account?
We did see that.
Did you see instances where Chase would make deposits into Joseph's account?
We did.
Okay. And how did you see that?
The deposit slips.
Okay.
Actually, I'm gonna object, lacks foundation and is speculative.
Overruled answer me.
I want to talk to you about Well, we're gonna go to part two. You were given another assignment in this case to look at Dan Kavanaugh's records, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And did you do that? And what, if you did, what records did you review in regards to Dan Kavanaugh?
If you give me a moment to change gears here.
Sure.
So we looked principally at PayPal and bank records for Daniel Kavanaugh.
And in regards to time periods, was there specific time periods that you were asked to concentrate on?
I'm not sure we were asked to look at any specific time frames, but we did look at Q3 2005 through the end of 2010.
So the third quarter of 2005?
Correct.
Okay, so since I'm not that economically sophisticated, what is the third quarter? When does that, what are we talking about?
Third quarter starts in July. I'll have to find the schedule that's got the exact date on it.
That's okay. So we're just talking about July of 05 to, let's say, January or the beginning of 2010. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Now,
I'm sorry. I distracted myself. You said January of 2010?
the beginning of 2010.
We actually looked at some Kavanaugh records that went through the end of 2010.
Okay. In terms of, was one of the questions that you were asked to determine is what was Dan Kavanaugh's financial situation at the end of 09, beginning of 2010?
Objection relevance violates court's previous rulings.
Sustained.
So payments, were you asked to look at the PayPal records as to payments that were made to Dan Kavanaugh, let's say in January and February of 2010?
Yes.
And did you do that?
Yes.
Okay. And did you kind of do a schedule to reflect that?
There is a short schedule that we prepared.
Okay. And that would be Exhibit 1127.
I don't have the number.
Just before while they're looking at it, can you give the exact dates of what you, in terms of this exhibit, what dates you looked at?
I don't have that in front of me. So.
Okay. I'll give you another copy.
I have not found it.
Okay. Do you have that in front of you?
I do.
All right, so January 4th, 2010 to February 13th, 2010?
That's correct.
And were there payments made from Joseph's PayPal account to Dan Kavanaugh
Yes.
during that time period?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I'm going to concentrate just initially on the payments from January 4th to February 3rd, 2010, okay?
Yes.
All right, so you recognize this?
I do. That's the schedule I prepared.
Okay. Let me just zoom out a little here. If you just point out to the jury what we're looking at, and then I'll blow it up again.
So you asked me to concentrate on 1/4/10 through 2/3/10, which would be this last payment here at $25.
Okay. And starting with the top at January 4th, there's a payment of $600, correct?
Correct.
And the payments range anywhere from, after that, from $200 to $25, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then if we go to after February 3rd, if you can identify the first payment after February 3rd.
First payment would be on 2/10/10, and the amount has slid off the page. So that first payment was $900.
Okay. And that was on 2/10.
That's correct.
And then the next payment on 2/11.
Yeah. So I can read off of mine. I can't read off of this.
Okay.
So the next payment is $200
Okay, and that's on 2/11.
on 2/11.
And then if you just go through them all real quick so that you can just get that in, and then I can have you not turn around anymore.
So 3,000, and
2/12.
that's on the 12th.
Okay.
There's a second one on the 12th for $800, and then on the 13th, there's one for $3,000.
Okay. And that's the 13th. Okay. Now, were you able to review the PayPal records and determine how these payments were made from Joseph to Dan Kavanaugh on February 10th? If it's Joseph's account.
Yes, he would have had to have hacked into.
That's not what I asked.
Objection calls for speculation.
That's not what I
Move
asked.
to strike the answer and admonish the witness.
The last answer is strictly the jury's instructed, disregard the last answer.
That's not what I asked you. I asked you, did you review the records and determine how those transfers were effectuated starting on February 10th?
We did review the records.
And what did you see?
We saw that those were made by Daniel Kavanaugh.
Okay. How,
Objection calls for speculation.
Well,
Lacks foundation and expertise.
subject to a motion to strike, it sounded like the next question was gonna be, how did you determine that? So, go ahead.
how did you determine that?
We determined that by looking at the records in PayPal.
Objection misstates the exhibit as well as the PayPal records. Lacks foundation.
Overruled.
Your Honor, may we be heard? It mischaracterizes the evidence.
Well, it's a speaking objection and it doesn't.
The
So
objection's overruled.
Thank you.
You can explain what he did and how he came to his conclusion.
Did you notice that there was a password reset on February 10th?
Yes.
Okay. Is that what you meant by hacking in?
Objection calls for speculation. Argument ended.
Had there ever been a time that you noticed in the PayPal records from the very beginning that Mr. Kavanaugh ever went in himself and took money out of Joseph's PayPal account?
Objection again calls for speculation. Lacks foundation.
Sustained.
Did you ever see in any of the PayPal records that you examined that Daniel Kavanaugh went in and did a password reset?
Objection calls for speculation. Lacks foundation.
Sustained as to who may have done it, if any.
Okay. Did you see any? Well, let me ask you this: how would Dan Kavanaugh was paid through PayPal on several occasions prior to February 10th, correct?
That's correct.
How did that usually occur?
It generally occurred by a request from Daniel Kavanaugh to Joseph for payment.
And then that would either be accepted or denied.
That's correct.
Okay. If it were accepted, then Joseph would then send the money.
That's correct.
Okay. And were these transactions after February 3rd, so starting on February 10th, were those done differently than the previous transfers?
They were. There was no evidence of a request.
Okay. And no evidence of a request and also evidence of a password reset?
That is correct.
Okay. And were you aware that on February 10th, when that first transfer is made for $900, that Dan Kavanaugh also claimed to have made a welfare check call to the police, or to the San Diego Sheriff's Department?
Objection misstates the evidence.
Sustained as calls for hearsay.
To your knowledge, Was the San Diego Sheriff's Department even involved in the case on February 10th at all?
Objection relevance.
Well, it lacks foundation with this witness and calls for hearsay,
Sustained.
and misstates previous testimony and evidence.
Objection sustained.
So these transfers were made, and you have the last one here, February 13th. Did additional transfers from PayPal to Dan Kavanaugh occur after February 13th?
Yes.
Okay. Now, so, do you know how, well, you indicated that with EIP, there was two separate QuickBook accounts, correct? There was a custom and then there was a, I guess, a retail.
Objection misstates his testimony.
Sustained.
To your understanding, was there two separate businesses, a custom business and a online business?
Yes.
When you reviewed the financial records?
Yes.
Okay. And what was your understanding of in reviewing the PayPal records and the bank statements, how the retail or online business received payment?
So those payments would have come through online transfers, often through PayPal. We have found evidence that there were other credit card vendors involved as well, but there would be credit card payments received for online sales.
And so people go online and they select a waterfall and then they click it and they pay for it through a credit card of some sort?
Objection
Objection.
leading calls for speculation.
Overruled.
Yes,
And then the money goes into Joseph's account, correct?
correct.
Now, after Joseph disappeared, did that business continue? Did people keep ordering waterfalls?
It did. That business did continue.
Did the money go into Joseph's account at Union Bank?
There was a period of transition so that it did for a period of time, and then it went into a different account.
Do you know, okay, so let me ask you first, when did it stop going into Joseph's account, all those online orders?
My recollection is that transition was a March, April kind of a transition.
So you're talking 2010?
2010.
All right. So March, April 2010, it's going to Joseph. Then did the payments start to go to another location after that?
They did. They went to a Kavanaugh account.
So do you know how long all those orders and all those payments for those fountains went into Kavanaugh's account?
The records that we examined went through the end of 2010.
Do you know what the total amount that Dan Kavanaugh took in when it came to these online orders from, let's say, February 10th, 2010 to when he sold the company, which would be in July of 2011?
The PayPal orders that came in were about $127,000.
I'm talking total. So PayPal,
So
bank.
there would have been, in addition to that, there were some wires that came in, there were ATM deposits, and in total, the income was $206,164.
And that money went into Kavanaugh's account.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, for the online orders, based on your review of the records, when Joseph was in charge, when he got an online order, what was the next step in that online business?
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Were you able to determine whether Joseph would then order a fountain from one of the suppliers, like Adagio or Blue World?
Objection calls for speculation, lacks foundation beyond the scope of his expertise.
Sustained.
Did you see, after payments would come in from these online orders, would there be corresponding orders to suppliers such as Blue World?
Yes.
Okay. And when Dan Kavanaugh was receiving the $206,000, did he also have a, oh, by the way, before I get into that, what do you call that charge when let's say Joseph goes and buys a fountain to send to the customer. Is there a term for that?
Well, we talk about that kind of business as being a drop ship business, if that's what you're asking.
Well, we can talk about that, but I did want to ask you, what is that expense called? Is it cost of goods? Is it business expense? What is it?
Yeah, so the purchase of the product itself would be cost of goods sold in an accounting sense.
Okay. So, were you able to review Joseph's cost of goods on the payments that he received for online business as a percentage?
They
I don't want to go
time.
through. I don't want to go through each and every transactions. There was thousands of them, but
Overruled.
So I took these from the 2007 and 2008 tax returns that we had, because the Schedule C reports revenue and cost of goods sold. The difference of those is gross profit. So we were able to look at a gross profit percentage that was reported by Joseph on his tax returns. In 2007 it was 29.8%, and in 2008 it was 41.1%.
so for a layperson, what does that mean? How much? Let's take 2007. For every $100 that Joseph receives, how much is he spending on a fountain to buy a fountain?
Cost of goods sold would then be about 70 cents on the dollar.
So, for $100 I get from a customer, I then have to go buy my fountain for $70
Correct.
to send to them, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Did that number change when it came to Kavanaugh? He received $206,000. Did you get a cost of goods sold percentage for Mr. Kavanaugh?
We did. We calculated a cost of goods sold for that $206,000 of revenue of $58,677. That gross profit then was $147,487, and it was 71.5%.
Okay, so since I'm not a great accountant, let's see what that means. So for every $100 that Mr. Kavanaugh got, Joseph spent $70 to go buy a fountain, right?
Correct.
How much did Mr. Kavanaugh spend?
30.
30. Okay. How did you account for that?
Objection calls for speculation.
Were you able to account for that, or do you have an opinion as to why that big difference?
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Let me ask you a hypothetical question. If Dan Kavanaugh gets payments for waterfalls, right?
Yes.
And he doesn't buy the waterfall, and instead spends the money.
Objection.
Would that
assumes
account for
facts
that?
and evidence.
Objection sustained is calling for speculation and conclusion and assuming facts not evidence.
Well, you said the cost of goods sold was 30% for Kavanaugh, correct?
Correct.
Is there anything in the records that you were able to see that would account for that difference, where Joseph had to spend $70 for a fountain and Kavanaugh would only have to spend $30?
We didn't find any direct evidence, and so the inference that I drew from that was that he in fact wasn't buying as much
Objection,
product.
speculation,
Sustained.
move to strike.
The last portion of the answer is stricken. Again, the jury's instructed to disregard the last portion of the answer.
Did you break down the $206,000 on how that money was accounted for from an accounting standpoint?
The $206,000 of revenue,
Yes.
we did determine from where it came.
Okay. What about how it was spent?
So the spending, the total spending during that same time frame was $173,000.
So during that time frame, Kavanaugh spent $173,000 of the $206,000.
That's correct.
And we're talking about a 10-month time frame, is that correct?
Approximately, yes.
And of the $173,000 that was spent, you said $58,000 was spent on buying waterfalls.
Objection.
Objection.
Misstates his testimony. Calls for speculation.
Overruled and answer if that's correct.
That's correct. I said $58,677.
Okay. How much was attributed in an accounting way for personal expenses?
Objection,
Relevance
Sustained.
violates court's ruling.
Sustained on both grounds.
Well, just as a yes or no, were you able to,
Objection, not relevant.
Well, I haven't heard the question yet, so.
you were able to account, or at least put into accounting categories how the money was spent, correct?
We split the money into 5 different categories.
Okay. And to split those in 5 different categories, you were able to look at Dan Kavanaugh's PayPal records, correct?
Yes,
You were able to look at Dan Kavanaugh's bank statements, correct?
correct.
Okay. Now, your analysis went until what date? You started in for Kavanaugh, the $206,000 that he received. What was the ending date of that?
The last payment that we have record of from PayPal is 12/7/2010.
Now, there was testimony that the company was sold in July of 2011. Was there any activity in the company after December 2010 until July 2011?
Objection, lacks foundation as phrased.
Overruled.
We didn't find any records past the December PayPal records.
December 2010?
December 2010.
Okay. Do you know if the company was transacting business? Was there any record of that through the bank statements or through any other records that you reviewed that the company EIP was actually transacting business from December to July of 2011?
We don't have any records of sales during that period of time.
Your Honor, can we approach for one moment before I go into this next area?
Sure. With recorder. So,
I'm sorry, Your Honor. Your Honor,
I'm sorry. Ready?
Yes.
All right. Mr. Moline, you're going to reserve the last portion of your direct examination, basically to include it in your redirect examination?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, that's fine.
Thank you.
Ms. Rodriguez, are you prepared to start your cross-examination now?
Yes, we can start, Your Honor.
Sure.
Good afternoon, Mr. Sherburne. How many pages of discovery did you actually receive?
Well over 10,000. I don't know exactly how many.
Okay, and so you reviewed all of those records personally?
I did.
Okay, and so there were individual reports that you had made or different charts and things like that that you used when you prepared your report, is that right?
Right. I am not the only one who did work on this case.
Okay, so who prepared all of those schedules that you relied on in creating your report?
So the process that I use is one of, I review with my team when everything comes in, so I'm looking at all of the documents, all of the data that comes in. Together we determine what it is we want to take a closer look at. I don't spend time extracting data, so I have staff who extracts that data. And then we look at what it is we want to analyze, how we want to do that analysis, and devise the format and forms that we're going to report it on.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, everything comes into your office and then you sit down with your team and you sort of assign out different projects to people, is that right?
Roughly speaking, I guess that's right.
Okay, so when you say that somebody else extrapolates all of the data, does that mean that you individually didn't go through all 10,000 plus pages that were used in this case?
So I don't mean to correct, but we didn't extrapolate the data, we extracted the data. And we did look together at all of the data. I looked at all of the data that came in. We spent a lot of time examining what it was that we had. We have to do that to identify what's missing as well as what it is that we have.
And so you started that process in
Your Honor, if she
2016?
can be instructed not to interrupt, the witness was in the middle of his answer.
Finish his explanation.
So go ahead.
I'll finish the next one. I don't know where I was.
You started that process in 2016?
We did.
Okay, and what did you receive in 2016 when you started that process?
We received large notebooks full of paper, and we received digital format.
What did you receive in digital format?
As far as I know, my recollection is that it was the same. It had been scanned. So we verified that. We looked at it to see whether we had everything that was scanned. We made sure that we had it all in a PDF form that could be read and examined.
Okay, so you received copies of QuickBook records, right?
Yes.
And those included two different accounts, right? The custom account and then the EIP account, right?
So we received a lot of QuickBooks records. The two accounts that I referenced earlier today were specifically the clone accounts that we got to look at.
Okay, so what I'm asking you right now, though, is what you received in 2016. Did you receive access to and documents containing the custom and EIP accounts in 2016?
Yes.
Okay. And in those accounts that you received, you were able to access different things like profit and loss statements and things like that, right?
We did, but
Customer lists, right?
So my approach to QuickBooks is I don't rely on QuickBooks.
I understand that, but that's not my question to you, sir. My question to you...
Your Honor, he's explaining his answer.
My question to you is, were you able to access in 2016 the customer information, client information, transaction lists, income by customer, things along that line?
We did not have access to the digital QuickBooks. We had only paper printouts.
Again, my question to you is, did you have access to that information related to the QuickBooks accounts in 2016?
Objection asked and answered.
It explains what he did and didn't have.
So if I understand your question, you're asking if I had lists of clients, if we had profit and loss statements, if we had typical reports out of QuickBooks. Is that your question?
Yes, sir.
Yes, there would have been typical reports.
Okay. And contained in that, you had the EIP custom information, right?
Certainly some of it.
Okay. What did you have?
And so when I say I didn't rely on it because I don't find it to be useful.
Okay, sir, when I ask you a question, I would appreciate it if you could answer the question I asked you. My question to you directly was, in 2016, what information did you have with respect to the custom account?
So at this point, I can't give you a detailed list of everything that we had from QuickBooks.
Okay, would it help to look at your report to refresh your recollection?
Sure.
I'm going to show you page 1 of your report. And it has a list of different documentation that you received, right?
Correct.
And it has the QuickBooks account on there, right?
It does.
And what items does it list that you had?
We had profit and loss detail, balance sheets, client lists, transaction lists, income by customer, sales by customer, invoice lists, check details, deposit details, and activity logs.
Okay. And that, you also put a disclaimer on there that that doesn't include everything that you may have received with respect to the QuickBooks accounts, right?
That's correct.
Thank you. And in fact, I called you in December of 2009. Do you recall, or I'm sorry, in 2018. Do you recall that?
I do.
Okay, and specifically I had asked you about the report that you prepared. Do you recall that?
I do.
And I asked you about documentation that you had used in preparing your report, right?
Yes.
And do you recall me asking you about an email and if you had reviewed a particular email?
I don't remember that.
And that's the email that you've testified about here today, right? The email from February 4th of 2010? Or I'm sorry, February 1st of 2010 that Joseph McStay sent the defendant?
Okay.
You don't recall me asking you about that email?
I don't recall, but I hadn't seen it at that point, so.
Okay, well, do you recall telling me that when I asked you about it, that you had received boxes and boxes of information?
Yes.
Okay. And in fact, you prepared your initial report in this case, and it was essentially 7 or 8 pages, right?
I don't remember how long it is.
Okay, well, do you want to take a look at it?
If you say 7 or 8, I'm fine with that.
Okay. And when you prepared that report, you didn't have any of the spreadsheets or anything that you testified about here today, right?
That's correct.
And how many of the spreadsheets did you actually prepare just yesterday?
Well, since we got those on the 13th, we've been working on them, so we finished them yesterday. We didn't do all the full preparation of them yesterday.
So my question again is how many of the reports or these spreadsheets that we're looking at did you actually just prepare yesterday?
I would say that we finished probably a dozen of those yesterday, wrapped them up.
Okay, and those were the documents that you had your son email this morning at 9:30?
I don't know when he emailed.
And you actually sat through testimony of our expert, Mr. Weitzman. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And you recall him testifying and going through some particular charts relating to gambling and things like that, right?
Yes.
And while you were sitting here in court, you and your son prepared exhibits related to that, right?
Yes.
And those hadn't been prepared or looked at prior to December of 2018, right?
That's correct.
And you didn't consider that to be important when you prepared your initial report, right?
We didn't prepare them before that.
Okay, so it wasn't relevant to you when you prepared your initial report, right?
Yes, I guess.
And you did actually have access to the defendant's bank records at that time, right?
Yes.
Now you indicated that you had billed approximately $31,000 up to date. How much do you make per hour?
Objection relevance.
So at the time that the agreement was struck on this engagement, my personal billing rate was $250 an hour. I discount all of our billing rates by 20% for government work. So
You realize that you're testifying for the defense,
Objection,
that's not government, right?
objection,
If he considers retained by the defense government work, that's fine.
Do you understand that?
I do.
Okay. And so you indicated that you hadn't been paid in the last year, right?
I don't recall precisely when the last payment was, so that's my recollection.
Okay, and approximately how many hours do you think that you have to add to what you've billed thus far?
We haven't stopped to add that up, frankly, so I don't know.
Well, you indicated just previously that you've been working on this pretty much nonstop since April 13th, right?
I wouldn't say nonstop, but we've certainly put a lot of hours into it.
Okay, and so it's $250 an hour per you, and then how about for additional people that work on it?
So I have two other billing rates that are then discounted at the 20%, and that's 90 for administrative help and 155 for staff accountant.
Okay, and so you could potentially have yourself, a staff accountant, and an office assistant or whomever working on it all at the same time, right?
Yes.
Now you prepared, or somebody else from your office, based on what you testified to, prepared a series of schedules that were used and referenced throughout your report. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And those were not prepared by you, if I understand correctly, right?
So I supervise all of the work directly, and we design those, and I approve them, and then somebody else populates the data in them.
Okay, but my
For
question
those
is
that I
you
don't do.
didn't actually prepare those yourself, right?
Some I did,
Okay, so some of them you did and some other people did, right?
that is correct.
And you rely on them to be accurate when they input the data and things like that, right?
Yeah.
Because that's all information that you use when you prepare your final report, right?
That's correct.
And you indicated that you had not received any information about that email, that February 1st email, until when?
I'd have to look back in the records, but that February, that 2/1/10 emails, sometime in the last month or less has come to us. I don't remember precisely.
And how did you obtain that email?
I believe the defense sent that email to us, but I can't tell you right now. The computer expert Brian sent the ledgers that it references.
But you had the email prior to that?
A day or two.
And then you were asked somewhat to go through those and try and make sense of all of that, right?
That's correct.
Because you actually hadn't looked at any of the data related to Mr. Merritt, really, had you?
We had very little data to look at. Yes.
Okay, well, if that information was contained in the initial records, you just weren't provided it by the defense. Would that be fair?
We hadn't seen it until just recently, so I. Yeah.
So you just weren't provided that information, right?
Objection, misstates the step.
16.
Because your initial report that you did, you were asked to focus primarily on Dan Kavanaugh, right?
That was the records that we had at the time we produced that, and we had very little to do with to look at for Chase.
Well, you had very little to look at that you were provided. That would be a fair statement, right?
Well, since everything that we looked at was something that was provided, I guess that's a fair statement.
Okay, so you only looked at what you were given by defense, right?
Yes.
Okay. So if there was other information that wasn't provided to you that existed, that could be relevant to your analysis, right?
Yes. I'm not sure how to answer that. If you didn't send me something I should have had, I didn't get it.
Well, you were hired by the defense, right?
Yes.
You're not working for the prosecution, right?
Correct.
Okay. And you only did one page of your entire report, just a few paragraphs related to the defendant, right?
That's correct.
And nothing in there even looks remotely at any of his gambling, right?
Correct.
Because you didn't consider that to be relevant, right?
Objection asked and answered.
Okay, are you familiar with the standards for AIC, PA,
I am.
and CFE?
I know what the certified fraud examiner is, yes.
Okay, do those standards apply to you at all?
Yes.
And you would agree that objectivity and impartiality are an important part of those standards, right?
That's correct.
And integrity is also part of the standards, is that right?
Yes.
And the standards also require that you be honest and candid in the information that you provide, right?
Yes.
And you testified, in fact, today that when you do work for probate court and family law court and things like that, you do that in a neutral way, right?
That's correct.
Because you're just basically looking at numbers, right?
That's correct.
And so when you looked at the information in this case, did you do that in a neutral way?
We did our best to do it in a neutral way. That's always the approach we take.
Okay, so when you wrote in your report and used the language related to Mr. Kavanaugh, and you wrote in there, quote, and perhaps most damning is the evidence shows that McStay was terminating his relationship. Was that objective to you and impartial?
Well, I think that it was a fair comment. It was not meant to be prejudicial.
So using that language, and perhaps most damning to you, doesn't imply you're leaning one way over the other.
No.
That to you is an impartial statement. Objective.
I'm allowed to reach conclusions, and if I do that work to get to that conclusion in a neutral way, I can still reach conclusions that may not seem neutral.
Were you aware that that same thing was happening with respect to the defendant?
I'm sorry, which same thing?
Well, were you provided information that Joseph McStay was looking at different welders and things of that nature and potentially terminating his relationship with the defendant?
Objection assumes facts, not in evidence.
Overruled. You can answer if he was made aware of that.
I was not made aware.
Would that be important to you?
It probably would have been important in terms of understanding the framework for, how the numbers matter.
And with respect to the relationship between Dan Kavanaugh and Joseph McStay, you were not privy to any partnership information between the two of them, were you?
I was not.
And you also weren't aware of what their financial relationship was, right?
Beyond what I examined. That's
Right,
correct.
because you didn't have any inside access to what that was, right?
That's correct.
Now, going back to the QuickBook records, you indicated that you didn't take those at face value, right?
That's correct.
And you reviewed both sides of the account, right? Both sides, the custom side and the EIP side, right?
Yes.
And you don't take those records at face value because of the fact that somebody can go into the account and rewrite transactions, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And when you looked at the actual QuickBook records, one of the things that can't be overwritten is the activity log, right?
Correct.
And did you review the activity log on the custom side of the account?
We did.
Well, my lovely assistant is looking for that. Let me actually ask you about a different area. You indicated that the jobs that you reviewed, or the information, the financial information that you reviewed for the defendant, you indicated that any money that he received after the McStays disappeared was for jobs that had already been started prior to their disappearance, right?
I'm not sure. I don't believe I said that.
Okay, would it help to refresh your recollection to review your report?
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to show you the last page of your report, and if you can read the highlighted paragraph, and tell me if that refreshes your recollection.
Yeah, and that was, for what we knew at the time, that was a correct statement.
Okay, and so you actually wrote in your report, because you wanted your report to be thorough and accurate, right? This is what you believed you were gonna testify to, right?
At the time.
Okay, and
Not
this
counsel could
particular
vote.
report,
Counsel
I'm
could,
sorry.
if counsel could, it's vague as to time, as to the report.
Overruled.
and this particular report you wrote indicates that you examined money received by the defendant after the McStay's disappearance, right?
Yes.
And that those monies were for projects started prior to the McStay's death, right?
That's what we had access to at the time.
Did you review, or were you given information about Geist Construction Company?
No.
I'm going to show you a couple of exhibits, 768, 769, 770, 771, and 772, and tell me if you received any of those documents for your review.
Yeah, I don't recall seeing anything about Geist.
Okay, so these were not provided to you by the defense.
Objection assumes facts, not evidence.
Sustain his answer that he doesn't recall seeing those convenience.
You didn't use any of this in your analysis, right?
We did not.
And so were you ever made aware of the fact that the defendant was paid for projects by Geist Construction Company?
We were not.
Okay, and would that have been relevant to you in your analysis?
Yes, it would have been.
Okay, and you reviewed the bank records in this case for Dan Kavanaugh, right?
Up to a point, yes.
And you reviewed the bank records for the defendant, right?
Yes.
And do you recall when you reviewed those records, there being a transfer from the account of Dan Kavanaugh to the defendant of $5,000?
I don't recall it from 2 years ago, but I've seen it recently.
Okay, and that was for the Geist construction project. Do you recall looking at that?
So, my recollection from what we've seen recently is that the payment from Geist for $6,250 came in, and then there was a $5,000 transfer, but there's no indication that it was specifically for that project.
Okay, but you did observe that in the defendant's records.
We did.
But you didn't use that in your analysis at all.
We didn't have access to it then, did not see it then.
You didn't have access to let me finish my question. You didn't have access to the defendant's bank records?
I don't recall us seeing that or having that before. If we did, we missed it.
Okay, so let me show you. You had your report, right? And you had access to Dan Kavanaugh's bank records, right?
Yes.
And that's what you notated up at the top here, right? That you had access to Dan Kavanaugh's bank records up at the top, right?
Right.
And then when we look at the first page, you had access to the defendant's bank records, right?
Yes.
Okay, so it would be your testimony that you had access to both those bank records, but you missed that particular transaction.
We certainly didn't put a $5,000 transfer that had no data in it in terms of telling us what it was for. Didn't tie it to Geist.
So if it was made on the same day, you wouldn't have attributed that to Geist Construction Company?
We would have asked the question, but it would not have been definitive, may not have been definitive at least.
Do you know if you asked the question in this case?
I don't recall.
So would it be fair to say that if a transfer went into the defendant's bank account and you didn't know where it came from, you just assumed that wasn't related to anything relevant?
Objection argumentative.
Sustained.
Now going back to the QuickBooks records that we were talking about, actually this might be a good time to break, Your Honor, since it's almost 4.
Yeah, that's fine. We'll go ahead and take our evening recess at this time till 9:30 tomorrow morning. Keep in mind the admonitions previously given to you, not to form or express any opinions about the case, not to discuss the case. And again, that means not discussing anything about the case, neither witnesses, testimony, exhibits, parties, or attorneys. And one scheduling issue, as of right now, we probably are not going to be in session next Monday. That could change, but as of right now, we probably will not be in session that day. Okay? and we'll see everyone tomorrow morning, 9:30. And I'm afraid we'll need you back as well.